In the waning years of the Qing Dynasty, as China's ancient imperial system crumbled under the weight of foreign intervention and internal decay, a young man named Ip Man began his journey into the ancient art of Wing Chun. Born in 1893 in Foshan, a prosperous merchant city in Guangdong province, Ip Man entered a world caught between tradition and upheaval, where the martial arts that had flourished for centuries under imperial protection now faced an uncertain future in a rapidly changing nation. Foshan, in the early 1900s, was a city of contrasts that perfectly captured the tensions defining modern China. Ancient temples stood alongside foreign trading houses. Traditional craftsmen worked beside newly arrived industrial machinery, and martial arts schools that had trained warriors for imperial service now struggled to find relevance in an age of gunpowder and foreign influence. It was here, in this crucible of old and new, that the 13-year-old Ip Man first encountered Chan Hua Shun, the aging Wing Chun master who would introduce him to an art that would define not only his life, but the future of martial arts across the globe. Chan Hua Shun, known as Hua the Money Exchanger for his day job in Foshan's bustling commercial district, represented the traditional approach to martial arts instruction that had governed Chinese fighting systems for centuries. He accepted only a handful of students, demanded absolute dedication, and passed down techniques through careful personal instruction rather than mass teaching. When the young Ip Man approached him for training, Chan was already in his 70s, his legendary fighting days behind him, but his knowledge of Wing Chun's subtle principles intact. The Wing Chun that Chan Hua Shun taught was far more than a collection of fighting techniques. It was a philosophical system that emphasized efficiency over flashiness, directness over elaboration, and intelligent application over brute force. The art's legendary origin story, involving a Buddhist nun named Ing Mui, who created the system after observing a battle between a snake and a crane, reflected deeper principles about adapting to circumstances, using an opponent's force against them, and finding strength through flexibility rather than rigid resistance. Under Chan Hua Shun's guidance, Ip Man learned to embody these principles not just in martial practice, but in his approach to life itself. The training was demanding, requiring hours of repetitive practice of the basic forms, sensitivity exercises that developed almost supernatural awareness of an opponent's intentions, and philosophical discussions that connected martial techniques to broader questions of character and conduct. This traditional approach to martial arts instruction created bonds between master and student that transcended mere technical knowledge, establishing relationships of loyalty and responsibility that would endure throughout their lives.
The collapse of the Qing Dynasty in 1911 and the establishment of the Republic of China created new opportunities and new dangers for martial artists throughout the country. The traditional patronage systems that had supported martial arts schools disappeared overnight, replaced by an uncertain political environment where fighting skills might be valued by revolutionary movements, criminal organizations, or foreign powers with their own agendas. For Ip Man, now a young adult with exceptional Wing Chun abilities, these changes forced difficult choices about how to use his martial knowledge in a world where the old certainties no longer applied. The early years of the Republic were marked by chronic instability as competing warlords carved up China's territory while foreign powers exploited the nation's weakness for their own advantage. In Guangdong province, where Ip Man had established himself as a respected Wing Chun practitioner, the constant threat of banditry and political violence made martial arts skills more relevant than ever. Yet Ip Man chose a path that avoided direct involvement in the military conflicts that consumed so many of his contemporaries, instead focusing on perfecting his art and beginning to teach a small number of carefully selected students. This period of relative peace allowed Ip Man to deepen his understanding of Wing Chun's philosophical foundations while developing his own approach to instruction. Unlike some martial arts masters who guarded their knowledge jealously or demanded unquestioning obedience from students, Ip Man encouraged analytical thinking and adaptation. He taught that Wing Chun's principles were universal, but their application must be adapted to individual circumstances, body types, and temperaments. This flexibility would prove crucial when he later encountered students from different cultural backgrounds who needed to find their own way within the system's framework. The prosperity that Ip Man enjoyed during the 1920s and early 1930s reflected both his business acumen and his growing reputation as a martial artist of exceptional skill. His family's wealth allowed him to pursue martial arts without the financial pressures that forced many masters to commercialize their teaching or compromise their standards. He could afford to be selective about students, maintaining the traditional approach of accepting only those who demonstrated both technical aptitude and appropriate character. This selectivity ensured that Wing Chun's transmission remained pure, while creating a network of highly skilled practitioners who would carry the art forward into an uncertain future.
The outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 shattered the relative stability that had allowed Ip Man to perfect his art in peaceful circumstances. The Japanese occupation of Foshan in 1938 brought brutal military rule that targeted Chinese cultural institutions, including martial arts schools that were viewed as potential centers of resistance. For Ip Man, the occupation presented a moral crisis that would define his character and establish principles that he would carry forward for the rest of his life. The Japanese military authorities, recognizing the influence that martial arts masters wielded in Chinese communities, attempted to co-opt prominent practitioners into their administrative system. Ip Man was approached repeatedly by occupation officials who offered him positions teaching martial arts to Japanese soldiers or serving in collaborationist organizations. These offers came with substantial financial incentives and promises of protection for his family, making them difficult to dismiss during a period when simple survival was challenging for most Chinese civilians. Ip Man's refusal to collaborate with the occupation forces reflected not political calculation, but fundamental principles about the proper use of martial arts knowledge. He believed that Wing Chun's techniques and philosophy were gifts that carried moral responsibilities, that they could not be used to serve unjust causes, regardless of personal consequences. His decision to reject Japanese offers meant accepting poverty and danger, watching his family's wealth disappear while living under constant surveillance and the threat of retaliation. The years of Japanese occupation transformed Ip Man from a comfortable member of Foshan's merchant class into a refugee struggling for survival. The martial arts skills that had brought him fame and respect became liabilities in a world where any sign of Chinese cultural pride could trigger violent suppression. Yet these hardships also refined his understanding of Wing Chun's deeper purposes, teaching him that true martial mastery involved not just technical expertise, but the courage to uphold principles when doing so required personal sacrifice. The stories that emerged from this period revealed the quiet heroism that characterized Ip Man's response to impossible circumstances. Rather than openly confronting the occupation authorities, he found subtle ways to maintain Chinese cultural traditions and support community resistance. He continued teaching Wing Chun to a small number of trusted students,
passing down not just techniques, but the values that gave those techniques meaning. His example demonstrated that martial arts could serve as forms of spiritual resistance, even when armed rebellion was impossible.
The end of World War II in 1945 brought liberation from Japanese occupation, but not peace to China. The resumption of civil war between communist and nationalist forces created new dangers for anyone associated with traditional Chinese culture or pre-revolutionary social structures. For Ip Man, whose reputation and social connections marked him as a potential target of communist persecution, the victory of Mao Zedong's forces in 1949 necessitated a painful decision that would reshape the rest of his life and ultimately transform the global transmission of Chinese martial arts. The communist takeover of mainland China in 1949 triggered one of the largest refugee movements in human history, as millions of Chinese fled southward to Hong Kong, Taiwan, and other territories beyond communist control. Among these refugees were many of China's most accomplished martial artists, scholars, and cultural leaders who feared persecution under the new regime's radical policies. Ip Man's decision to join this exodus meant abandoning everything he had built in Fosan, leaving behind his ancestral home, his established reputation, and most of his worldly possessions to start over as an impoverished refugee in British Hong Kong. Hong Kong in 1949 was a city overwhelmed by the influx of mainland refugees, its limited resources stretched to breaking point by the arrival of hundreds of thousands of desperate people seeking safety and opportunity. The established Cantonese community that had prospered under British rule found itself vastly outnumbered by newcomers who brought different dialects, customs, and expectations. For martial artists like Ip Man, this environment presented both challenges and unprecedented opportunities to share their knowledge with diverse audiences. The Hong Kong of the 1950s, where Ip Man established his Wing Chun school, was a unique cultural laboratory where traditional Chinese arts encountered international influences in ways that would have been impossible on the mainland. The British colonial administration's policy of non-interference in Chinese cultural affairs created space for martial arts schools to operate freely, while the city's role as a global trading port exposed Chinese masters to students from around the world. This cosmopolitan environment would prove crucial in shaping the next phase of Wing Chun's evolution. Ip Man's early years in Hong Kong were marked by financial hardship and the challenge of rebuilding his reputation in a new environment. Unlike Fosan, where his family's social standing and generations of residents provided automatic respect, Hong Kong required him to prove his abilities to skeptical audiences who had no knowledge of his background. The small apartment where he began teaching Wing Chun bore no resemblance to the spacious training halls he had known in mainland China. Yet it became the crucible where traditional Chinese martial arts began their transformation into global phenomena.
The Wing Chun school that Ip Man established in Hong Kong during the early 1950s represented more than just the continuation of a traditional martial art in a new location. It became a bridge between China's classical fighting traditions and the modern world's hunger for authentic martial knowledge. The students who gathered in Ip Man's modest training space included not only fellow refugees seeking connection to their cultural heritage, but also Hong Kong natives, overseas Chinese, and even some Western expatriates drawn by curiosity about Chinese martial arts. The teaching methods that Ip Man developed during this period reflected his understanding that traditional approaches needed adaptation to serve students from diverse backgrounds and motivations. While maintaining Wing Chun's essential principles and technical standards, he became more systematic in his instruction, developing clearer progressions and more detailed explanations than had been necessary when teaching only a handful of carefully selected Chinese students. This pedagogical evolution would prove crucial when he encountered a student whose destiny would carry Wing Chun far beyond the boundaries of traditional Chinese martial culture.
The atmosphere in Ip Man's Hong Kong school during the mid-1950s crackled with creative energy and cultural tension. Students practiced ancient fighting forms while discussing modern philosophy. Traditional Chinese values coexisted with Western influences, and the master himself continued evolving his understanding of how martial arts could serve human development in a rapidly changing world. It was an environment perfectly suited to producing revolutionary thinking about the nature and purpose of martial training. Among the young men who came to learn Wing Chun during this fertile period, one student would stand out, not just for his technical ability, but for his restless intelligence and cross-cultural perspective. This student would take the seeds planted in Ip Man's Hong Kong school and scatter them across the globe, transforming not just martial arts, but popular culture itself. The arrival of this exceptional student would mark the beginning of Wing Chun's journey from obscure Chinese fighting system to global phenomenon. But that transformation would require more than technical excellence. It would demand the kind of revolutionary thinking that could only emerge from someone who had lived between worlds, who understood both Eastern wisdom and Western ambitions, and who possessed the charisma to make ancient principles speak to modern audiences. The stage was set for an encounter that would change martial arts history forever. A meeting between an aging master who had preserved traditional knowledge through decades of upheaval and a young man who would carry that knowledge into an entirely new realm of possibility.
In 1954, a skinny 13-year-old named Li Junfan walked into Ip Man's modest Wing Chun school on Hong Kong's bustling Nathan Road, carrying with him a unique combination of cultural influences that would prove perfectly suited to revolutionizing martial arts on a global scale. Born in San Francisco's Chinatown while his father performed in Chinese opera tours, Bruce Lee embodied the East-West duality that would later define his approach to martial arts and popular culture. His return to Hong Kong as a child of immigrants placed him at the intersection of Chinese tradition and Western modernity, a position that would prove crucial in translating ancient fighting wisdom for contemporary audiences worldwide. The Hong Kong where young Bruce Lee encountered Ip Man was a city of refugees and dreamers, a place where traditional Chinese culture mixed with British colonial influence and international commerce to create something entirely new. Lee's family operated in this cosmopolitan environment, his father, Li Hoi Kune, working as an actor in Cantonese opera, while his mother, Grace Ho, connected the family to Hong Kong's Eurasian elite. This background gave Bruce a perspective that differed markedly from Ip Man's other students, most of whom came from purely Chinese cultural contexts, and approached Wing Chun as an ancient tradition to be preserved, rather than a living system to be evolved. The initial encounter between master and student revealed both the promise and the challenges that would define their relationship. Ip Man recognized Bruce's exceptional physical coordination
and keen analytical mind, qualities that made him a natural martial artist, capable of mastering Wing Chun's subtle techniques with unusual speed. Yet he also sensed in the young man a restless energy and questioning nature that might challenge traditional approaches to martial arts instruction. The master, who had spent decades perfecting classical Wing Chun, found himself confronting a student whose very presence suggested that the art might need to change in order to survive and flourish in the modern world. Bruce Lee's training under Ip Man during the mid-1950s took place during one of the most creative periods in Wing Chun's evolution. The master had refined his teaching methods through work with diverse groups of Hong Kong students, developing clearer explanations of principles that had previously been transmitted through observation and repetition alone. For Bruce, this systematic approach to instruction proved ideal, allowing him to absorb not just techniques, but the underlying logic that made Wing Chun effective. He learned to think about martial arts as systems of principles rather than collections of techniques, an approach that would later enable him to synthesize ideas from multiple fighting traditions. The philosophical discussions that became central to Bruce's education under Ip Man revealed the depth of thinking that both men brought to martial arts study. Unlike students who were content to memorize forms and combinations, Bruce constantly questioned why techniques worked, how they might be improved, and whether traditional methods remained optimal for contemporary conditions. Ip Man, rather than discouraging this analytical approach, engaged with Bruce's questions in ways that deepened both their understanding of Wing Chun's essential principles. These conversations established patterns of critical thinking about martial arts that Bruce would carry forward throughout his career.
The late 1950s represented a crucial period in Bruce Lee's development, as the techniques he learned in Ip Man's school were tested and refined through countless street encounters in Hong Kong's rough working-class neighborhoods. Unlike many martial arts students who trained primarily in controlled school environments, Bruce actively sought opportunities to apply Wing Chun principles in real confrontations, treating the city streets as an extension of his training ground. These experiences taught him that martial arts effectiveness required more than technical correctness. It demanded adaptability, timing, and the psychological toughness to perform under pressure. Ip Man's response to his students' street fighting activities reflected his understanding that martial arts training served purposes beyond self-defense or physical fitness. He neither encouraged nor condemned Bruce's extracurricular battles, but used them as teaching opportunities to explore the ethical dimensions of martial arts practice. Through careful questioning and discussion, the master helped Bruce understand that fighting skill carried moral responsibilities, that the power to harm others must be balanced by wisdom about when such power should be exercised. These lessons in martial ethics would later influence Bruce's approach to teaching and his public advocacy for martial arts as tools of personal development. The Wing Chun principles that Bruce absorbed during this period provided him with more than fighting techniques. They offered a systematic approach to problem solving that would serve him throughout his life. The art's emphasis on efficiency taught him to eliminate unnecessary movements in both physical and mental activities. Its focus on directness encouraged him to address challenges head-on, rather than through elaborate strategies. Most importantly, its principle of using an opponent's force against them showed him how to turn obstacles into advantages, a lesson that would prove crucial as he navigated the entertainment industry and cultural barriers that stood between him and global success. The relationship between Bruce Lee and his Wing Chun classmates during this period revealed both his exceptional abilities and his growing sense that traditional martial arts might need radical transformation to remain relevant. While other students were content to master classical forms and techniques, Bruce constantly experimented with modifications and improvements, testing whether Wing Chun principles could be enhanced through integration with other fighting systems. This experimental approach sometimes created tension with more traditionally minded students, yet it also demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking that Ip Man had always encouraged in his most promising disciples. The cultural tensions that Bruce experienced as a Chinese-American student in Hong Kong's martial arts community foreshadowed the broader challenges he would face as he attempted to bridge Eastern and Western approaches to martial arts. His mixed heritage sometimes made him an outsider in purely Chinese contexts, yet this same background provided him with perspectives that purely Chinese martial artists lacked. Ip Man recognized that these cultural tensions, rather than being weaknesses, were actually sources of strength that would enable Bruce to communicate Chinese martial arts wisdom to non-Chinese audiences in ways that traditional masters could not.
Bruce Lee's departure for the United States in 1959, ostensibly to complete his education, but actually to escape the consequences of one too many street fights, marked the beginning of Wing Chun's transformation from regional Chinese fighting system to global phenomenon. At 18, Bruce carried with him not just the technical knowledge he had absorbed in Ip Man's school, but also a revolutionary vision of how martial arts could serve as bridges between cultures and tools for personal transformation. His arrival in Seattle placed him in an environment where these ideas could be tested and developed in ways that would have been impossible within traditional Chinese martial arts communities. The University of Washington campus, where Bruce enrolled in 1961, provided an ideal laboratory for his experiments in cross-cultural martial arts instruction. His philosophy classes exposed him to Western analytical approaches to Eastern thought, while his diverse student body offered opportunities to teach Wing Chun principles to people from completely different cultural backgrounds than those who had traditionally practiced Chinese martial arts. The martial arts demonstrations he gave on campus attracted audiences who approached Chinese fighting systems without the cultural preconceptions that shaped Chinese students' learning, forcing him to develop new methods of explanation and instruction. The Junfan Kung Fu Institute that Bruce established in Seattle represented a radical departure from traditional Chinese martial arts schools. Rather than maintaining the secretive, exclusive atmosphere that characterized most Wing Chun instruction, he created an open environment where students from different backgrounds could explore martial arts principles together. His teaching methods emphasized understanding over memorization, adaptation over rigid adherence to classical forms, and individual development over uniform compliance with traditional standards. These innovations attracted students who might never have been accepted in traditional Chinese schools, while establishing new models for martial arts instruction that would influence generations of teachers. The philosophical framework that Bruce developed during his Seattle years reflected his growing understanding that martial arts could serve as vehicles for exploring fundamental questions about human nature and potential. His famous concept of the art of fighting without fighting emerged from his synthesis of Wing Chun principles with Western philosophical concepts, creating new ways of thinking about conflict resolution that transcended purely physical approaches to self-defense.
These ideas attracted attention from intellectuals and spiritual seekers who saw in Bruce's teaching something more profound than conventional fighting instruction. The martial arts community's mixed response to Bruce's innovations revealed the tensions between traditional and progressive approaches that would define his entire career. Some Chinese masters viewed his openness to non-Chinese students and his modifications of classical techniques as betrayals of cultural heritage that diminished the purity of traditional arts. Others recognized that his adaptations were actually preserving essential principles while making them accessible to new audiences who could carry martial arts wisdom into the future. Ip Man's support for his former students' experimental approaches provided crucial validation that enabled Bruce to continue developing his revolutionary ideas.
Bruce Lee's transition from martial arts instructor to entertainment industry revolutionary began with his move to Los Angeles in 1964, where his exceptional abilities attracted attention from television and film producers seeking authentic Asian talent for American audiences. His screen debut as Kato in the Green Hornet television series introduced millions of Americans to Chinese martial arts for the first time, demonstrating fighting techniques and philosophical concepts that had previously been confined to small, specialized communities. Yet even as he achieved mainstream success, Bruce continued developing the martial arts innovations that had begun in Ip Man's Hong Kong school and evolved through his Seattle teaching experiences. The late 1960s American cultural environment proved perfectly suited to Bruce Lee's message about martial arts as tools of personal liberation and self-discovery. The counterculture movement's interest in Eastern spirituality, the civil rights struggle's emphasis on empowerment through self-determination, and the youth rebellion's rejection of traditional authority all created audiences receptive to Bruce's teaching that martial arts could transform individuals and societies. His appearances on talk shows and in popular magazines presented Wing Chun principles as practical philosophies for navigating modern life's challenges, rather than merely historical fighting techniques. The development of Jeet Kune Do during this period represented Bruce Lee's most radical departure from traditional martial arts, while simultaneously fulfilling the essential spirit of his training under Ip Man. By synthesizing Wing Chun principles with techniques and concepts from boxing, fencing, wrestling, and other fighting systems, he created an approach to martial arts that emphasized adaptability and personal expression over adherence to any single traditional method. Yet the core principles that guided this synthesis, efficiency, directness, and the use of an opponent's force against them, remained those he had learned in his master's Hong Kong school. The philosophical writings that Bruce produced during his Hollywood years revealed the depth of his understanding of martial arts as systems of human development rather than merely physical training. His famous concepts like "be like water" and "the way of no way" transformed Wing Chun's practical fighting wisdom into universal principles that could guide personal growth in any field of endeavor. These ideas attracted followers who had no interest in fighting, but were drawn to the psychological and spiritual insights that emerged from martial arts practice. Through his writing and teaching, Bruce demonstrated that the lessons learned from Ip Man could be applied far beyond the boundaries of traditional martial arts contexts. The global impact of Bruce Lee's films during the early 1970s carried Wing Chun principles to audiences that traditional Chinese martial arts instruction could never have reached. Movies like Fist of Fury and Enter the Dragon presented martial arts not as exotic curiosities, but as sophisticated systems of thought and action that deserved serious study and respect. The
The fighting scenes that captivated international audiences were built upon Wing Chun techniques and principles, introducing millions of viewers to concepts like simultaneous attack and defense, the center line theory, and the importance of sensitivity in combat. Through cinematic storytelling, ancient Chinese fighting wisdom reached people across every continent and cultural background.
Throughout Bruce Lee's American career, his relationship with Ip Man continued to evolve through correspondence and occasional visits that deepened both men's understanding of how traditional martial arts could serve contemporary needs. The master in Hong Kong followed his former students' innovations with interest and pride, recognizing that Bruce's adaptations were actually fulfilling Wing Chun's essential purpose of providing practical tools for self-improvement and self-defense. Their ongoing dialogue demonstrated that authentic martial arts traditions could embrace change and growth without losing their fundamental identity or value. Ip Man's response to his students' global success revealed the wisdom that had made him an exceptional teacher from the beginning of his career. Rather than feeling threatened by Bruce's modifications of classical Wing Chun or concerned about the publicity that surrounded his former students' activities, the master understood that Bruce was carrying forward the most important aspects of his teaching in ways that traditional instruction could never have achieved. The principles that Bruce taught to millions through films and demonstrations remained those he had learned in the modest Hong Kong school, even though their applications had expanded far beyond anything that earlier generations of Wing Chun practitioners had imagined. The philosophical discussions between master and student during Bruce's later visits to Hong Kong focused increasingly on the deeper purposes that martial arts could serve in human development. Both men had come to understand that fighting techniques were merely vehicles for exploring more profound questions about the nature of conflict, adaptation, and growth. Their conversations revealed how Wing Chun's emphasis on efficiency and directness could guide not just physical movements, but approaches to all of life's challenges. These insights would influence Bruce's final period of creative work before his untimely death in 1973. The legacy that Bruce Lee created through his synthesis of Ip Man's teaching with his own innovations demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of authentic martial arts principles when they are understood at their deepest levels. The millions of people who were inspired by his films to begin martial arts training, the philosophers and psychologists who found practical wisdom in his writings, and the teachers who developed new approaches to instruction based on his example, all became part of an extended lineage that traced back to the aging master in his Hong Kong school. Wing Chun's journey from obscure Chinese fighting system to global phenomenon revealed the power of traditional knowledge when it is transmitted by teachers who understand both its classical essence and its contemporary relevance. The premature death of Bruce Lee in 1973 cut short a career that had already transformed martial arts and popular culture while demonstrating unprecedented possibilities for cross-cultural communication through physical training and philosophical exploration. Yet the ideas he had developed through his synthesis of Wing Chun principles with his own innovations continued to spread and evolve, inspiring new generations of martial artists, actors, writers, and thinkers who found in his example proof that traditional knowledge could be adapted to serve contemporary needs without losing its essential power. The conversations that had begun in Ip Man's Hong Kong school during the 1950s continued to reverberate through global martial arts communities, philosophical movements, and entertainment industries decades after both master and student had passed away.
The relationship between Ip Man and Bruce Lee represented more than the transmission of martial arts knowledge from one generation to the next. It demonstrated the dynamic process through which traditional wisdom adapts to serve new times and circumstances without losing its essential character.
The Wing Chun principles that the master had preserved through decades of political upheaval and cultural transformation found new expression through his students' innovations, proving that authentic traditions maintain their vitality through creative interpretation rather than rigid preservation. Their partnership showed how mentorship at its best involves not just the passing down of established knowledge, but the collaborative exploration of new possibilities that neither teacher nor student could have discovered alone. The global impact of their work together extended far beyond martial arts communities to influence approaches to education, personal development, and cross-cultural communication that continue to shape contemporary life. Bruce Lee's synthesis of Eastern and Western ideas, built upon the foundation of Wing Chun principles he had learned from Ip Man, provided models for bridging cultural differences that remain relevant in our increasingly connected world. Their example demonstrated that the most profound forms of learning occur when traditional knowledge encounters fresh perspectives, creating new understandings that honor the past while serving present needs.
The millions of people around the world who practice martial arts today, whether they follow Wing Chun specifically or other systems influenced by Bruce Lee's innovations, participate in a living tradition that connects them to the conversations between master and student that began in 1950s Hong Kong. The principles of efficiency, directness, and adaptability that emerged from those discussions continue to offer practical guidance for navigating contemporary challenges, while the philosophical insights about conflict resolution and personal growth remain as relevant now as they were when first articulated. The legacy of Ip Man and Bruce Lee proves that the most valuable aspects of human knowledge transcend the specific times and places of their origin to offer timeless wisdom for all who seek to understand themselves and their world more deeply.
In the end, the story of these two remarkable individuals reveals something fundamental about the nature of authentic tradition and meaningful innovation. Ip Man's dedication to preserving Wing Chun's essential principles through decades of upheaval created the foundation upon which Bruce Lee could build revolutionary new approaches to martial arts and personal development. Their partnership demonstrated that tradition and innovation are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of living wisdom that grows stronger through each generation's creative engagement with inherited knowledge. The conversation between master and student that began with a 13-year-old's curiosity about Chinese fighting techniques ultimately became a dialogue between cultures that continues to inspire and instruct people across every boundary of nationality, ethnicity, and belief. The Wing Chun that traveled from Ip Man's Hong Kong school to Bruce Lee's global audiences and beyond represents one of the most successful examples in human history of how traditional knowledge can adapt to serve contemporary needs while maintaining its essential identity and value. Their partnership demonstrated that tradition and innovation are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of living wisdom that grows stronger through each generation's creative engagement with inherited knowledge. The conversation between master and student that began with a 13-year-old's curiosity about Chinese fighting techniques ultimately became a dialogue between cultures that continues to inspire and instruct people across every boundary of nationality, ethnicity, and belief.
The Wing Chun that traveled from Ip Man's Hong Kong school to Bruce Lee's global audiences and beyond represents one of the most successful examples in human history of how traditional knowledge can adapt to serve contemporary needs while maintaining its essential identity and value. Their story reminds us that the most important lessons learned in martial arts training about perseverance, adaptability, and the proper use of power
apply far beyond fighting contexts to guide us in addressing all of life's challenges. Through their example, we understand that authentic mastery involves not just technical proficiency, but the wisdom to know when tradition should be preserved and when it should be transformed to serve new purposes. The dance between preservation and innovation that characterized the relationship between Ip Man and Bruce Lee continues today in martial arts schools, philosophical discussions, and creative projects around the world. Their legacy lives on not in any single technique or concept, but in the approach to learning and teaching that they developed together, an approach that honors the wisdom of the past while remaining open to the possibilities of the future. In this way, the conversation that began between an aging master and his restless student in 1950s Hong Kong continues to unfold, offering new insights and inspiration to all who are willing to engage seriously with the profound questions about human nature and potential that martial arts training inevitably raises. Subscribe, and welcome to the Empire.